Hey guys, Mrs. Kraz here. Today we're looking at Chapter 4, Section 2, Colonial Society. So we're going to start with life on farms because, most of the work that people had to do when they arrived in the colonies was farm work, right? We saw that was the work that needed to be done so people could feed themselves and survive. So it's important to remember that farms were really far apart from each other. So if you had a large family, that was considered a big advantage in the farming industry. That means there are a lot of people around that can help with jobs around the farm, right? If your nearest neighbor is 3 miles away, you're probably not going to be able to go over and ask him for a quick favor. But if there are lots of kids and extended family living close together in the farmhouse, that means there are more people to pitch in with the work. So farmhouses themselves were made of wood and had very few rooms. Typically there was a fireplace in the kitchen, and that was the only source of warmth. Looking at some gender roles in life on farms. So men controlled a family's income and property completely, and family members were expected to accept the man's authority completely. Men were permitted to vote and hold public office, and also they obviously did a lot of the day-to-day physical labor that was on the farm. Women faced, obviously, a different situation. So often women were forced to marry men that were chosen by their parents. And when a woman got married, all of her property and all of her money became her husband's. Legally, it was not seen as hers anymore. She did not have any legal possessions. It became the property of her husband, charmingly enough. When it came to the day-to-day running of the farm, women had to take care of the children. They had to do the cooking and housework. There's an E missing there. That's all right. And women also contributed to some of the physical tasks on the farm that I mentioned men had to do as well. Like we said, a large family was a way to get more labor, so kids were not free from this, structure. Children under the age of 7, for the most part, could just play and have fun like modern children, not have to worry about things. Once you hit 7, things changed. So boys who were 7 or older often worked in the fields with their fathers. They would become apprentices if they were learning a trade, such as building furniture or making shoes. And girls over 7 helped their mothers with their domestic responsibilities. So we're seeing that from a very young age, kids are trained in the jobs that come with specific gender roles. Right, so moving into the issue of social class, which will take up our attention for the rest of the slideshow. So, all in all, at this period in history, owning land was a really large factor in social class, right? If you own your own piece of property, you're somebody. And often when we talk about this in class, people will ask, well, what's the alternative to not owning land? Well, renting, right? That's what most of us do. If you rent property, it's not yours yourself. You're just paying the owner a fee so you could stay there. So, getting back to olden times. So in Europe, right, a person's social class was determined by their birth. If they were born wealthy, they'd typically stay wealthy. And the connection between that and land might not be so clear, but it's hidden in there, right? Because there's only so much land available in Europe, which is very well developed, right? If your parents own land, they will pass it down to their children when they die, and so on and so forth. So the same land is staying in your family's name. Unless times are really hard, it's unlikely to sell off that land. So that means, wealth was pretty structured. If your family had wealth, they had the money to own land, you would own it too. Your class would be pretty stable. But in America, right, we've got nothing but land, right? Here in the colonies, there is so much land that is free, actually occupied by Native Americans, but the early colonists did not pay much attention to that. So it was easy to obtain land, and if you could gain land for yourself and you didn't own it previously, that means your social class could change more easily, right? You have access to what it takes to up your status, so to speak. So now let's look at some specific social classes in the colonies. So the gentry was the upper class, the highest class in colonial society. This included wealthy planters, merchants, ministers, royal officials, and successful lawyers, as well as successful artisans. So these are people that are skilled in certain crafts, and they do what they do well. The gentry was few in number, but highest in power, and we'll look at that a little bit more in class. Now, it's important to note that most public officials were a part of the gentry. And if you're like me, you hear that and you think that doesn't sound so democratic, right? But it was actually more of it's not so democratic, right? If only the rich are having their voices heard, something's wrong there. But there was a practical reason behind this at first. So remember, most legislatures in the colonies, they didn't pay at the time, right? You didn't do that as your primary job or your primary source of income. That was just a way that you were contributing to life in the colony, and it had nothing to, it had nothing to do with your income. You had another job that gave money to you and put food on the table. So since those jobs didn't pay, if you're someone who is, a poor citizen, you can't spend the time that you have to spend to be a public official, right? That time is better spent working to gain money and put food on the table for your family. So it was the gentry who already had a lot of money that could afford to have this leisure time that went towards doing work for the public good. So that's something to keep in mind. The next piece of the social pyramid is the middle class, and they were the largest percentage of the population. Most people fell into this middle class category. They were neither extremely rich nor extremely poor. They included small planters, independent farmers and artisans, people who had, specific jobs, but maybe weren't super successful or didn't operate these jobs at a big scale, right? Men who were middle class could vote because it had to do with owning property. And what's most important about the middle class is that the middle class gave hope to the poor. They believed that they could work really hard. The poor believed that they could work really hard and one day become middle class themselves, right? It would be a big jump to see the gentry and say, well, I could go from, barely having any food to eat in a day to being this high, noble person in society. But to get from the bottom of the period to middle class, that seemed attainable. And that's going to give a lot of people hope, and that's going to be one of the things that shapes what will become known as the American dream. And we'll talk about that more in upcoming chapters. Right now, we're not even officially America, the United States, just yet. Okay, moving on to take a look at indentured servants. So indentured servants signed a contract to work for 4 to 10 years in exchange for someone to pay for them to come to America. So while they were working in that 4 to 10 year period, they weren't getting a salary, right? They were probably getting room and board provided by their employer. But there was very often little to no money going in their pockets because they got paid in advance. If it costs $400 to take a trip to the colonies, and I'm making that number up, okay, I will pay for your ticket now. You're going to work for me for 4 years at $100 a year and basically pay off the debt that you owe me. That's the way indentured servitude worked. So indentured servants were seen just above enslaved Africans in the social hierarchy because really, they were also not benefiting from their labor, but indentured servants knew that freedom was coming their way. And in the 1600s, most indentured servants came from England. Later in the 1700s, some came from Ireland and Germany, and we'll look and see at specific factors that pushed people from those countries and over to the colonies. Our last slide for today, free Africans, not shockingly, due to the racism we've already seen in colonial America, they are near the bottom of the pyramid. So free Africans were allowed to own their own property. And interestingly enough, this was a tidbit the textbook included, this meant that they were allowed to own slaves. And some free Africans actually purchased slaves in order to then go ahead and set them free, which is a pretty radical way of working a loophole in the system, I would say. Most Africans, even if they were free, were not allowed to vote or serve on juries. You might be looking at this big overview of social class and saying, well, how did free Africans come to the colonies versus slaves, and why aren't slaves included here? We will spend the next section examining the answers to those two questions. So stay tuned and have a lovely afternoon, guys.